Welcome to the Revamped Energy Talks podcast, and I have a special treat for you today. Someone that I've known of for a very long time, back to my years growing up in Manitoba, the former Premier of Manitoba, Ed Schreyer, and the former Governor General of Canada. And you may not know this about Ed, but he was also an energy economist, or an economist with a lot of interest in energy issues. He was a minister of Manitoba Hydro for many years, and he has been involved in public policy discussions around energy ever since. So welcome to the interview, Ed.
Thank you, and thank you for such a sincere intro. I hope I can live up to your promo.
Well, Ed, you've heard this story, but my audience has not, so I'm going to tell it. So, folks, I grew up in Gillam, Manitoba, which is about I think it's 1,100 kilometers north of Winnipeg. It's way up just south of Churchill, and my dad worked in the first Manitoba Hydro generating station on the Nelson River. Now, if you have never seen the Nelson River, go Google pictures of it because it's spectacular. It's a very, very big and fast flowing, and it's very interesting. And the Kettle Rapids Dam was the first major hydro dam on there. It had 12 generators. It stretched for hundreds of yards across the river. And we moved there in 1971, and in 1974. Little Markham was working as a stock boy in the Gillam Co-op, and I was making 90 cents an hour, if you can believe it. And the premier at the time brought in the first minimum wage legislation and bumped my wage from 90 cents to $1.75. It was like doubling my wage overnight, as you can imagine, for somebody who was in grade 9 or 10 at the time. This is a big deal. And so I've been a Ed Schreyer fan ever since. So I have to say, Ed, thank you very much for that. I really appreciated the raise.
I don't feel it was money or effort wasted. Thank you.
Well, look, let's talk about Manitoba Hydro. I mean, that is a subject that's near and dear to my heart and yours as well. You became premier in 1969, and my understanding is that you were the minister in charge of Manitoba Hydro from that point on. And maybe just tell us about how you got interested in it, what your plans were, that kind of thing.
Well, I became interested in Manitoba Hydro for several reasons. One being that I grew up in eastern Manitoba, not very far from the Winnipeg River, which was and remains a small but energy potent river, I'll put it that way, in the southern Canadian Shield. Only 40, 50 miles from Winnipeg as the crow flies. And on that river, since the beginning of the 20th century, we've managed to put in place 4 or 5 hydro dams, small to middle size, and they proved to be a total justification. I mean, they really gave southern Manitoba and Winnipeg a good solid energy grounding. I don't quite know what we would have done without the Winnipeg River, but eventually the province outgrew that, and so we had to look north. Unfortunately, the next scenario involved a river, the Nelson, as you mentioned, which is a much bigger river and capable of taking a number of much larger hydro dams. Problem is, however, that it was 500-600 kilometers north, and it required some sort of outside the box thinking as to transmission. And to give them credit, the engineering leadership of the day came up with the idea of using high voltage direct current. I mention that because this may astonish you, but when Manitoba Hydro put in place the high voltage direct current transmission from the Nelson to Winnipeg and beyond to Minnesota, this was the first in all of North America. And we needed a bit of help on that. And I'm happy to say that the government of Canada, the federal government in those days, seem to be much more supportive of resource development and especially renewable resource development than they are today. Because, as you know, I'm sure you know that for the past couple of decades, all the talk about a national grid and electricity grid in Canada has fallen on deaf ears. It hasn't happened. Well, in 1969, 70, the government of Canada, starting with Lester Pearson and then Pierre Trudeau, they agreed to with Manitoba and Manitoba Hydro, to finance the building of this first in North America high voltage direct current transmission line. And they even provided all of the financing through the Agency of Atomic Energy, ironically, AECL of Canada, with the provision that it be paid back at Manitoba Hydro's earliest ability or convenience to do so. And that was done about 10, 15 years later. So it really was a very positive occasion. I wish there was more of that cooperative federalism that Lester Pearson used to talk about. I wish that there was more of that today.
And we will get to that. I have another little anecdote for you, Ed. The hydro dams, and I hope I've got this right. I think I do. Generated the power in AC, alternating current, and
Yes.
I worked after my 2 years, between grades 11 and 12, something like that. I worked for Radisson, which was the converter station, because you had to convert it from AC to DC for transmission down to Winnipeg.
All this is deja vu for you, I can see.
Oh,
I
well,
mean,
we're,
you've been through this.
we're going back almost 50 years. It's been a while,
Yes,
Ed,
yes.
but
Actually, a little more than 50.
so
Yeah.
the story I wanted to tell is they made me and remember, folks, this is an era where transistors were in their infancy. So
Yes.
now everything is done electronically. Back then, it was done mechanically, and they used mercury arc valves. You couldn't even breathe this stuff. You had to when you rebuilt these things, you had to go in and they had a clean room. You put on a mask, you put on a white suit. It was a toxic, hazardous environment. But I have all kinds of stories, but one is they kept it dark, and there were 12 valve halls, they were called, and it was like something out of a Frankenstein movie because they would arc, the valves would arc, and you would see them all. Sometimes all 12 of them would arc at the same time, bzz, 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 and it was quite a sight to be walking down there and to see all 12 of them light up like that. So yeah, it kind of brings back memories, Ed. So the high voltage DC lines were a real innovation.
Yes, they
Um,
were.
what about the technology for the generating stations themselves? Because if I remember correctly, that was kind of innovative, was it not?
Well, yes, it was. But I regard the HVDC innovation as being the most important, because without it, I doubt very much that we would have had the motivation or the courage to go that far north and attempt to bring the power south in the older AC, because there's too much in the way of line losses. So
Sure.
this
That's
was
a
an
long
important
distance.
innovation, and I repeat, the first in all of North America, and as I recall, only the third or fourth in the whole world at the time. So
Now,
it was really avant-garde in many ways. Yeah.
when I was in high school, Manitoba Hydro started building more dams along the river, Nelson River. There was Limestone and Long Spruce, and
Yes. Yes.
I left. There was Kanawapa, and there's been some more since. Do you
Well, I
know?
will stop there because Kanawapa was supposed to have. I mean, to me, it's one of a major regret that Manitoba and Manitoba Hydro have not yet seen fit to develop Kanawapa. The story gets complicated rather quickly, but the fact of the matter is that it's almost, maybe I'm too much involved, but it's almost heartbreaking to me to see Kanawapa go unharnessed, because it would be part of the same cascade. And when you can cascade powerhouses on a river, you do minimal environmental disturbance, and it's a pity not to take advantage of all that. But I haven't lost hope. I still think that Conowapa, which is going to be, it would be in the order of 12 to 1400 megawatts. I still think it'll be done. And if we go into electrification of transport, it almost necessarily will get done. It'll cost a lot of money, but it's money that would be transferred from the payment people make now, thinking about it, for oil and gas from other jurisdictions. So it wouldn't cost the individual consumer anymore. It just would be redirected. But there's nothing new about that in the world of energy.
Ed, the Alberta oil sands gets a lot of attention these days and has for a while as Canada's biggest industrial project. And frankly, it's hundreds of billions of dollars and it deserves a lot of attention. But I don't think Canadians understand the magnitude of what was going on in northern Manitoba in building all those dams are massive, massive undertakings. And then you include all the other infrastructure like the conversion stations and the transmission lines and so on. What you started there was really it was really something else, but it's hidden away up north and very few people really understand it.
Yes, well, all I can say is that it stood the test of time. I certainly have no feelings of regret at the way it all unfolded and the way it got built, planned and built. Even though I still bear some scars of a political kind from it all, because as you can appreciate, you don't get major projects underway and completed without some controversy. And some of it may be justified, and a lot of it, I don't mind saying, is a complete nonsense. But nevertheless, it does leave scars. But in retrospect, if you were to ask me, I'd say I certainly would be prepared to do it all over again. And by the way, I must give credit to the chief engineers at the time, in the person of the late Don Stevens and Len Bateman and David Casbeggs. They provided excellent executive stewardship when they were heading up the corporation.
Let's talk about the bigger picture, get away from the specifics and the bigger picture here, because you were trained at the London School of Economics. You got a degree from the University of Winnipeg. You went out to the London School of Economics.
No. I had many acquaintances that did, but I myself did my university at University of Manitoba, and a lot of that was actually extramural.
Okay.
By that I mean yeah.
Okay, but where I'm going with this, Ed, is that you saw public ownership, the building of public infrastructure, as part of not just energy policy, but economic policy, economic development policy. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Well, I'll start by stating the obvious premise, which is that in the modern day, that it's impossible to think of civilization sustainable without the input of huge and generous amounts of energy. Now, so much so that during the 20th century, if you were to look at a graph of energy consumption, you would see that it moves along at a fairly modest rate of growth until mid-century in 1940, 1950 sort of thing. And then there is a steep exponential curve that is eye-watering, and that's the way it's remained. We've had little periods of 2 or 3 years where there seem to have been hiccups and momentary pauses, but for the most part, it's on and up, on and up. And at the present time, I believe that oil consumption, for example, is about 100 million barrels a day. Well, when we were getting concerned about the simply huge high level of oil consumption, it was 60, 70 million barrels a day. And we thought that was fantastic growth and fantastic level to sustain. Well, it's grown obviously by almost half as much again to today. 100, I repeat, 100 million barrels a day. And more so, if you look carefully, you'll see that more and more of it is not conventional oil anymore. It's oil sand, tar sand. It's deep off coast oceanic depths, etc. Why? It's because conventional oil is simply depleting. It's almost embarrassingly silly to mention that, but we it seems in human nature we would like desperately to think that there's going to be oil there forever, a petroleum source forever, when in fact you can see now the pattern is clear. If conventional oil was not depleting so quickly, why would we be choosing to go down the road of more and more expensive sources of oil, of energy?
Ed, one of the themes in the journalism that we do here at Energy Media is the electrification of the global economy. China and Europe and other parts of Asia are well ahead of North America, but it's coming. I mean, the electrical and the real innovation here is on the demand side, the devices that we electrify that we couldn't before, electric vehicles, heat pumps, industrial processes, industrial heat, that kind of thing. So I think, you mentioned earlier, if we continue electrifying transportation and other parts of the economy, we're going to need a lot more electricity. And I think, Prime Minister Mark Carney has already recognized that. We're talking about, building out this national grid or a couple of, big regional grids. And the question then becomes, who's going to do the building? Because we have lots of Crown Corporation utilities like Manitoba Hydro, but there's also a lot of pressure to do things with the private sector. And given your experience, maybe you could just comment on how you might see that unfolding.
Well, certainly there's need for it. Let's establish that first and foremost. But that's so obvious, one needn't dwell on it. So then the second point I'd make is that I think it makes sense to think in terms of having a federal crown corporation, or it can be very pragmatic and be a joint crown corporation, federal and provincial. Either way, I think it lends itself to a crown corporation ownership of a national grid, and they could charge a tariff or rate. Tariffs become a dirty word, so I'll say they can charge a rate for interprovincial transmission sufficient to cover their cost of existence, of operation. I don't see it as being in any way a formidably difficult concept to implement. And maybe then we would get over the problem. Right now, we're facing the problem of inertia. It should be done, but it's not being done, and it's not being done because it hasn't been done before. And this is the worst kind of inertia, almost sloth, I would say.
Yeah, I can see your point. We've kind of argued that here at Energy Media. One of the things I want to touch upon before we get too deep into the interview is the issue of Indigenous relations and Manitoba Hydro. And I'll, when I was going to living in Gillam, so grades 7 to 12, and I had plenty of friends, and within the local, the Fox Lake Cree Nation was in town. I went to school with many of their members, and they had a very different view of Manitoba Hydro, and it wasn't nearly as positive and rosy as maybe you and I have, because maybe they were displaced, some of their traditional territory was flooded. Tell us but you had to wrestle with that, and maybe you could tell us that story.
Well, I certainly did, and I don't presume to say that I managed to solve it or to go even any significant way down the road to solving it. It's a problem that remains, but I think it's a problem that is that relates to anybody that lives in close proximity to such a project, be they Indigenous or be they local farmers who have some of their best productive soil being covered over by flooding for a dam somewhere in the prairies. I mean, that happens too. At the end of the day, though, I think I am justified in saying that Manitoba Hydro did, and I personally did spend many, many hours in consultation with local communities that were affected. And sometimes the consultation did produce some positive result, however minimal, but positive. There was no dramatic breakthroughs, and we couldn't, at the end of the day, hold back from doing something that was of major benefit to the entire province because of the attitude of, let us say, a community of 150 or 350 people. So there you're back to the old chestnut as to the justification of the Crown or the public entity being able to, shall we say, build a road or a ditch or whatever with or without having to acquire land. And we hope and pray that it's done, if it's done, that it's done with the courts being able to adjudicate the value and put an independent appraisal on it. And that's basically what we've done. There's nothing new about the right of eminent domain.
That is true. Ed, you are also a proponent of long-term planning, and given the fact that my take on this, the electrification of the global economy, is that between now and 2050, so the next 25 years, we're going to see a major, major expansion of the renewable energy, the growth of could be dams, could be wind and solar and batteries, could be nuclear, could be a whole range of things in Canada, but we need to get that. We need that extra electricity. We're going to be adopting, electric vehicles, and including electric buses and so on. But how then should we go about long-term planning? Because this is not a provincial issue anymore. It really has become, at the very least, a regional, Western Canada, or national. How would any insights you might have?
Well, I mean, I've given a lot of thought to precisely that array of questions that you've put. And there's a great feeling of frustration wells up to the surface on that issue, that problem. For example, I think Canada is running a bit of a danger in the sense that since the Kyoto conference in 1997, and at every major international conference on climate change held since 1997, Canada has certainly, how can I put this diplomatically? Canada has certainly not been shy or bashful about pledging to, to achieve certain levels toward the ultimate goal of net zero. The problem is that although Canada is one of the best pledgers, we, in our actual doing and living up to these pledges, we've been doing very poorly. And that should be soon, if it isn't already, become a matter of major embarrassment. I think that we have an obligation to try to either live up to our pledges, or we should very deliberately cut back on our pledging. But to try and play both ends to the middle is, it's catching up with us. I think more and more people of other countries do sense that Canada is an example of not living up to its own pledges in the international fora.
Well, let me run something past you and get your response to it, because we've been, energy media has been around 18 years, so we've seen this debate go on for a long time. And watching the global trends of, renewable energy costs coming way down. Now, solar and batteries are cheaper than coal in most jurisdictions. We've seen the electric devices like EVs come way down in price. The Chinese EV deal that Prime Minister Mark Carney negotiated is an example. So here's the thing. If we argue now that because this technology has passed its inflection point, it's on the hockey stick part of the growth curve, is that we should, if to meet our climate commitments is not to focus on climate, but to focus on clean energy and the electrotech, as they call it, and really push forward with that with an economic focus. And that then plays right into the arguments that you made 50, 60 years ago about electricity as being a competitive advantage, our hydro dams being a competitive advantage. It's just a modern version of that argument. Would you agree or disagree, sir?
I think that you are on to an area I was going to use the word tangent, but that would, in a sense, be the wrong word. I think you're going certainly in the necessary and desired direction. I have quite a bit to say on this point because there's a great deal of frustration involved in not even in not pursuing what is the more obvious of the options facing us. I'll begin by saying that I've been a supporter of the environmental movement since the days of Rachel Carson, and I think you'll know who that was. But very quickly after she left the scene, the environmental movement hived off into different groupings, and I don't know if that's to be as a matter of surprise or not. But I really believe that yes, we must dedicate ourselves to doing as much as we practically and sensibly can to encourage the harnessing and use of renewable energy. Problem is that even there's such thing as too much of a good thing. You heard that axiom, and too much solar or wind energy in any given system presents problems of its own, which can be best addressed by making sure that you plan for and engineer a optimum blending of the two, be it solar or be it wind, blending of that with a stable backup at not a horrendous cost, and then so you're back to hydro. In some cases, it might have to be nuclear, and that's another long topic. We could go into the case of Germany, which has shot itself in the foot, if I may say so. We can go into that if there's time. But in Canada's case, we really should be encouraging renewable, but that doesn't mean that we should be somehow turning our back on hydro or nuclear. For the moment, natural gas is the favored, but natural gas, I'm not opposed to it, but it's not a panacea.
Ed, I've interviewed a number of international economists and energy experts about the very question that you posed about the renewables in a modernized power grid. And one of the best options that they would recommend is exactly what you talked about, where the wind and solar produce electricity at very, very low prices, sometimes negative prices. But they don't always, wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And you can use the hydro dams like a battery, like a big battery. So when the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, you can less electricity from the hydro dams, you can back up your reservoir, let the water back up. And then when you need it, you can let it flow, and then you've got the dispatchable electricity that you need. Or you can sell it, if you feel that the market warrants it, you can sell it to the United States or sell it to another province, whatever you want to do with it. But the pairing of renewables plus hydro is an enormous advantage that Canada has if it could just learn how to trade electricity east and west instead of north and south. Would you agree or disagree?
All the more reason for talking again and again about the desirability, almost a necessity of a east-west national grid in Canada. And by whatever agency, be it a Crown Corporation concept or some other, as long as it works. But that's what's needed. And what you're just describing, mind you, I don't know if you may recognize it immediately, but what you're describing is exactly what we've got going as between Manitoba Hydro and the Minnesota and Wisconsin and Nebraska power utilities, because in years of lower water, semi-drought or whatever, we do use our water, we back it up during the night, and we bring in on the interconnection electricity from Minnesota or Nebraska, as the case may be, small amounts, but enough to enable the hydro reservoirs to recharge. So it's working, and it works very well. In that sense, hydro is being used much like the same as a high-tech, expensive battery, which, by the way, I think we're going to see more and more of the big stationary batteries, because they will help to make solar and wind more viable. Until that happens, I'm afraid that solar and wind can be very quickly and too easily exaggerated.
Okay. Ed, I want to get your view on current negotiations between the provinces, because this has been a real problem in Western Canada, even in between Ontario and Quebec. Politics intrudes itself, and BC and Alberta are squabbling over their intertie. They have a 1,200 megawatt intertie, and they're squabbling about that. And I gather Saskatchewan is now talking to Manitoba, which it didn't do maybe in the past. What is required here? In your opinion, to get the provinces to cooperate with each other so we can build this national grid?
Well, that is a $64 question. There is no doubt that that is a very important practical question. If there were genuine solicitude and cooperation, then it would be possible, for example, to harness Kanawapa now rather than wait another decade or two. Think of it in this terms: what a pity it is. The water is running unharnessed, unused to the sea, and it's subtracting nothing from the next and ensuing generations, while at the same time we keep producing non-renewables, which once extracted are gone forever. So what we really need is the kind of cooperation you're hinting at. And I'm afraid one has to say that the reason we don't have that already well underway, we do have some, but it's nominal, really. The interconnection between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Manitoba and Ontario, between Alberta and BC, let's face it, it's almost what you would have to call nominal connections, and yet there's vast room for it. If you need any example of where the authorities have decided to adopt a politically popular alternative, say solar or wind, to the exclusion of all others, just look to Germany and to the province of Ontario, whereas the province of Ontario, not that many years ago, required by statute law that a certain amount of solar generated electricity must be statutorily required to be bought and absorbed into the grid, into the system. And that has resulted in Ontario and in Germany with sharply increasing electricity rates beyond what they were paying before. At the same time, we continue to wait another year or two or three before we build the next major hydro plant. You can see the folly of this, and it's due to, let's put it bluntly, the lack of adequate cooperation between the provinces on that issue. Provinces seem to be prepared to incur higher costs as long as they can show that it is home built.
Ed, I want to get your opinion on some announcement that was made last year by Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, where he said, we have 500 megawatts generating capacity contracted to Minnesota. The contracts are expiring. We're not going to renew them. We're going to send 50 megawatts of that electricity up to Nunavut. That's great. We'll build a transmission line there. And the rest of it, we're going to make available for Western Canadian development. Now, we didn't get any details about that, but that idea of maybe not exporting as much and using it east-west, this seems to be the kernel of the idea we're talking about. And what did you think of that announcement?
Well, quite frankly, I'm not sure that I'm enthusiastic about the idea as explained now, because if there is the opportunity to move power north and to Nunavut or east and west to neighboring sister provinces, then and if there's need for more power in order to do that, then let's build another plant. There's room, by the way, on the lower Nelson for another two significant major plants. After that, you could say, well, there really isn't any ideal sites left. There are some that will serve the purpose, but they're not ideal. But Konawapa and Sea Island, I call it, although it's not the official name, those really are outstanding and they should be harnessed. So the idea of cutting off export sale to the south in order to have the energy to move it east and west, to me, instead of skimping on the amount available now, let's increase the amount, especially if it's a renewable or quasi-renewable resource, which is what hydro is.
Sure, fair enough. I mean, instead of cutting back, build more,
Yeah,
and yeah, and we know there's that growth, load growth is going to grow. We watched it. We're watching the Americans grow at 3 to 4 or 5% sometimes,
yeah.
and
We have no reason to complain about our arrangement, which is now 50 years, almost 50 years in existence, of moving energy south to northern United States. Conversely, that means that gives us a tie-in interconnection so that in times of drought or emergency, we can move it the other way. We should be doing the same east-west. My only point is, my caveat is, just because there is a case to be made to take it east-west doesn't mean we should therefore shut off our opportunity for the sale of renewable energy to the south.
And there also is a very good argument to be made that the bigger the market you have, the more uh, regions that you can bring into your big power grid, and you can trade back and forth, the more stable it becomes, and the better you can integrate, renewables, because you can share power when it's needed, just as you described. Um,
Well,
Ed,
you put that so well, I have nothing to add. You've summed it up. There it is.
we've been reporting on this. We've been reporting on this issue for a while. I have to tell you. Um, so we need okay. So we need some better leadership, both at the federal level and the provincial level. So stop the squabbling, and we need to get going on the east and west, and we need to build some more generating capacity, of which Manitoba has quite a bit. Looking out ahead, aside from the building the two more generators, any thoughts on where Manitoba Hydro needs to go, what it needs to do between now and 2050?
Do you mean in terms of internal organization, or in what sense do you mean?
Well, I guess what I'm getting at here is, there's a big debate in the United States about what form the utilities are they going to evolve into something else? Because would they be a platform? Because for trading electricity, because you see a lot of self generation now, whether it's solar or wind, going behind the meter. And so with the utilities are going in that direction. Should it expand? Should it continue as a public corporation? How much should it build? Those kind of questions. If you have any observations.
I think one has to be rather pragmatic about questions of that kind, because one doesn't want to discourage smaller and more individually related sort of projects. But on the other hand, one also has to be realistic enough to acknowledge that, for example, there used to be a lot of talk about small hydro as being micro hydro, small hydro as being highly desirable, and solar on rooftops and the like. Well, this is all very well, and it shouldn't be discouraged. But at the same time, you have to realize that for a market of 40 million, in the case of the US, 300 million people, then small scale projects are of relevance to only small numbers of people. that it really does take planned and adequately sized and adequate scale projects to deal with the industrial societal needs and requirements of the day. In other words,
Ed,
you can't walk away from scale.
Ed, I can't let you go because we're nearing the end of the interview, but I can't let you go without some comment on your years as Governor General. What was that experience like?
Well, I mean, I look back on it with, they were years that were very, very pleasant. I was young enough and healthy, in good health, so that I was able to put on quite a pace in carrying out the duties of my office, including moving about the country as a whole. And Canada being the second biggest country in the world, there is a lot of room and a lot of geography to cover. And invitations, generous invitations from all parts of the country, including the high Arctic, which I was not only able but happy to accept, and I did accordingly. I am happy to be able to say, for example, that not only did we make many visits to communities in all 10 provinces, but in all the territories. I visited 20, I think 20 or 21 Inuit communities across the Arctic, almost all of them, in other words. I even got to go scuba diving at the North Pole, which is a memorable event for me. But yeah, I can sum it up this way. Being carrying out the duties of Governor General can be and were for me hectic, but they were never ones of high pressure. And that's the difference I found between being a governor general, and I would imagine a lieutenant governor, and a premier or prime minister, is that the one job is hectic with a great deal of pressure, and the other is hectic, but the pressure isn't there at all, except when it would be then the worst, and that is in the depths of a constitutional crisis. And then the Governor General's office can't remain aloof necessarily. I mean, if you have any great feeling for the country and its constitution, you hold your hand and pray that you don't get pulled into the vortex. But sometimes it might be unavoidable. And fortunately, I only know of one or two cases in all of the 20th century when that happened. We had a close call to that in Canada in 1927, but it didn't evolve into a full-scale crisis.
The King Bing crisis.
What I liked especially, yes, that's the one. Yeah, well, yes, there you are. Maybe one of your sorry, the word escapes me now. One of your podcasts, you can have someone who is learned in that field to talk about it. I just wanted to mention in closing on this point that Canada is such a vast and diverse country, culturally as well as geographically, with an amazing array of resources and resource management, and including energy as a resource, always managed to intrigue me. I never felt bored in researching those fields. And what I liked about being Governor General is that it enabled me to call just about any time to reasonable convenience on any of the senior echelon public servants in any given field, be it natural resources, agriculture, Arctic matters, and ask for a personal briefing. The Chief of Defense Staff, Minister of Defense, Deputy Minister, etc., to ask for a briefing. And they would always be delighted to come over to Rideau Hall and over a cup of tea or coffee, brief me to my heart's content. And I did take considerable advantage of that too. I remember, if I may, a little vignette, asking to be briefed on climate change at a time when it was just beginning to be used as a word in newspaper reports. And being curious about that, I did ask the department responsible for Environment Canada but if it was called that in those days, if they could send someone to brief me as to the substance of whether or not there was some imminent danger of climate change and so on. And interestingly, they arranged for it immediately, but they asked none other than the then president of the University of British Columbia to do the briefing rather than somebody from the department. And that was Dr. Ken Hare, whose name might be familiar to you if you're a British Columbian yet. He was a geographer, and therefore it was in his academic domain. But I remember talking to him for over an hour, or him talking to me, I should say, for over an hour, explaining what the concept was and what the basis in science might be for any notion that there was going to be a rather sustained escalation in CO2 in the atmosphere and what that might mean in practical terms to the world's climate.
Well, Ed,
so I remember things like that. Sorry?
Ed, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely. I know my audience will as well. Thank you very much for this. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and chat with you.
You're most welcome. Good luck in your work.